Bueno, buenos días. Vamos a empezar. Hemos sido de una extraordinaria puntualidad. El embajador también, puntualidad japonesa. Good morning. Morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Dear Ambassador, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. It is my pleasure to open such a timely event on the EU-Japan Partnership Agreements that entered into force just 3 weeks ago. We are going to discuss about an economic partnership agreement that constitutes the largest free trade, open trade area in the world, and two about a strategic partnership agreement that establishes a framework for enhanced multi-sector cooperation between the EU and Japan, areas that traditionally did not cooperate in other dimensions besides the economic one. So let me say a few words about these non-economic dimensions. We all know we are entering into uncharted waters in international relations. Not an era of changes, but a change of era, as is frequently said. We have seen it recently in the Davos conference, but also in the more recent Munich Security Conference. I don't know if we ever had an international liberal order, since it never was really international, nor fully liberal, nor indeed a true order. But it was being built and it worked. It worked satisfactorily for many decades. Even after 1989, we thought we had it. You know, Thomas Friedman published a famous book, The World is Flat. The world seemed to be flat without frontiers, without natural or without social frontiers. Just one world society, just one humankind for the first time probably in mankind's history. Well, today we know this unfinished liberal order is moving backwards, unfortunately. It's moving backwards. From a potential multilateral order to a unilateral one, from free trade to trade barriers, from free movement of persons to walls, from strong institutions to strong men. Indeed, weak institutions, but a strong man. Henry Kissinger talks of a Westphalian new disorder made of powerful countries, a disorder structured by the geostrategic competition between the United States and China, a decline in power, slowly and relatively declining, I must say, but certainly declining, and a rising one, a very fast rising new power. Both moving like huge carriers surrounded by allies and friends, and indeed a changing and moving set of alliances, and both clashing in the Pacific, mainly in the area that surrounds your country, Japan, that nowadays appear as the vanguard of the free world in the Pacific area. During the last decades, we could rely on the military umbrella of the United States against Russia on this side of Eurasia, against China on the other side of Eurasia. The US was the leading country pushing the world in the path of multilateralism, democracy, human rights, free trade. However, we ignore if that's any longer the case. We don't know if we can trust our main ally. Thus, the European Union is trying to become strategically autonomous. That's what the European Global Strategy says. Chancellor Angela Merkel, has repeated already several times that Europe must take its destiny in its own hands. Security and defense become again a relevant dossier in the European Union. So not only Japan, but the European Union as well is now in the midst of a strategic uncertainty. This uncertain environment forces us to work together. Spain in the frame of the European Union, Japan in the complex frame of the Pacific Ocean, where China, Russia, and the US clash. Thanks God, our relations, Ambassador, are improving. Last year, we commemorated the 150th anniversary of the opening of diplomatic relations between Japan and Spain, Far East and Far West. But we share many things. We share values and principles. Even we share institutions, both monarchies, by the way, parliamentary monarchies, among the few world democracies. We share concerns for human rights, for the rule of law, for free trade. King Felipe and Queen Letizia traveled to Tokyo last year is a testimony of our mutual friendship and understanding. Also reflected in the strategic partnership signed between Spain and Japan last October during the visit of your Prime Minister Abe to Spain. And since you are an expert in Latin America, Ambassador, let's not forget our mutual interest in the area. That's the general frame of this conference. 1st of February, the Economic Partnership Agreement entered into force, and since then, a large part of the bilateral strategic partnership agreement applies to on a provisional basis. Both agreements signal the commitment of the European Union and Japan to an open, fair, and rules-based international order. Indeed, the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement is a new generation free trade agreement, which not only opens a market equivalent to almost a third of the world GDP, but also sets ambitious standards in different areas that could influence future international efforts for trade liberalization. For its part, the strategic agreement provides, as I said before, a comprehensive framework for enhanced political and sectoral cooperation in areas of common interest, including, of course, the dossier on security. This is the more concrete frame of this conference, a conference that gathers officials and experts from different European countries and Japan to discuss in detail the implications of this agreement on our bilateral relations, but also on global governance in this context of stability. I do not want to finish before thanking the Embassy of Japan for supporting our efforts to better understand Japan's foreign policy, and to all of the speakers that will participate in the next two sessions. In particular, I would like to stress my gratitude to those who are coming from very, very far away to share with us their insights, to the Fundación Botín that provides us with this fantastic environment, to Mario Esteban, our mover and organizer, and indeed to all of you for your attention and for finding time to participate in this event. I'm sure this is going to be a fruitful and even, I hope, a pleasurable experience. And now let me welcome the Ambassador of Japan in Spain, Mr. Masashi Mizukami. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emilio Ramo de Espinosa, Chairman of the Real Institute of Elcano, our authorities, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, I had the honor of inaugurating this seminar. It gives me true satisfaction to be here again as a sign of the steady and successful collaboration between the Embassy of Japan and the Real Institute Elcano. So allow me first to thank the Real Institute Elcano and especially its chairman, Mr. Emilio Ramo de Espinosa, and his colleagues for hosting this seminar and for this kind invitation. I am delighted to share the floor with such distinguished participants from the Spanish Ministry of Industry, Trade and Tourism and Ministry of Defense, as well as with prominent Japanese and European experts. This public panel discussion will aim to foster a free debate between Japan and European scholars on how Japan and Europe, global partners who share universal values such as freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, can work together to strengthen their cooperation for free and open international liberal order. I am sure that this panel discussion will be a great opportunity to launch some useful input from both Japan and European countries. I believe that this public event offers not only a chance for Japanese and European experts to meet and exchange opinions and views. It is also an outstanding chance for Japanese experts to collaborate with the Real Institute Elcano, ranked the 9th best think tank in West Europe and the 15th in the world in 2018. In short, it is a perfect scenario for the cooperation between Japan and Spain. As you probably know, and as also the chairman mentioned, last year, Japan and Spain celebrated the 150th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. And this year, Japan and Europe are celebrating the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, which entered into force on 1st February. Ladies and gentlemen, let me underline that we are witnessing an era of change and uncertainty. The free and open international order is facing several challenges. Therefore, Japan and Europe two of the traditional main supporters of the international liberal order, have to strengthen their cooperation in order to maintain and reinforce the existing international order. Today, we will discuss two issues of utmost importance of the two global partners, such as Japan and Europe, the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, as well as the Japan-EU Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA, and cooperation in the free and open Indo-Pacific region. I'll briefly mention some key elements. I'd like to recall that the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement will create one of the world's largest free, advanced, industrialized economic zones that account for 600 million people, 30% of the world's GDP, and 40% of the entire international trade. Amidst the various protectionist movements beginning in the world, the creation of this free and trade zone shows the economic significance of Japan and the EU together promoting free trade. In my belief, this deal shall bring prosperity not only to Japan and the EU, but also to the entire world. The second session of this seminar will focus on the Japan-EU strategic partnership and cooperation in the free and open Indo-Pacific region. I expect that the SPA will contribute to building strategic relations going forward between Japan and the EU, which share fundamental values as well as with the countries of the EU, including key member states such as Spain. This strategic cooperation must provide answers in a context marked by geopolitical uncertainty. In this regard, a free and open maritime order based on the rule of laws is cornerstone for the stability and the prosperity of the international community. Therefore, Japan and Europe, which are benefiting from the freedom of navigation, can never accept any unilateral attempt to change the status quo and have the responsibility to make the oceans a global common good that favors peace and prosperity, inclusiveness and fairness. Regarding this subject, Japan promotes the free and open Indo-Pacific. I strongly hope that today we will have the chance to address these issues. Let me conclude my saying that I find really interesting that this seminar will reach a broader public audience through the real issues, the Elcano website and its multimedia tools and social media. I am sure that it will help deepen the cooperation between Japan and Europe and between Japan and Spain. We all must work together towards this shared goal, a free and open international order. And we must look for ahead to move forward. As the Spanish philosopher Ortega Gasset and put, there is only room for progress when you think big. And finally, I want to mention one item that about 2 weeks ago, our minister had the opportunity to visit Barcelona to talk with the Japanese businessman in Barcelona. And still, they have some small complaint to the Spanish authorities, especially maybe the Ministry of the Commerce, etc. That's still in enforcement of the reality of the Japan-EU EPA are not reached to the end of the local officials. So some still they are facing some difficulty to get import items to the Europe under the new schemes. And I expect that the agreement is agreement, but also the good realization, the good practice is also important for the Japanese people that lead to the real fruitful of this agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We are again just in time, 10:15. And let's move now to the first session about the implications of the Economic Partnership Agreement. I call the speakers and the moderator to the table. Thank you very much.
Good morning. We are going to continue with this first session on the implications of the Economic Partnership Agreement between the European Union and Japan. As you're all aware, and the Ambassador already said, the Economic Partnership Agreement between the European Union and Japan entered into force this month of February, on February 1st, 2019. And it is an economic partnership agreement. It's not a free trade agreement. So it is more ambitious and more comprehensive than only a tariff agreement. In terms of tariffs, it reduces 99% of current tariffs between Japan and the European Union. This would be and have important implications for products like chemicals, textiles, plastics, metals, and agricultural products. But it also includes a strong commitment to protect the values that are shared between the European Union and Japan, like the protection of labor standards, environmental protection, consumer protection, SMEs promotion, public services, and public procurement. In terms of savings, it has been estimated that it will help to save 1 billion euros per year in tariff cuts, but the implications are more important than that. And this is what we are going to talk with these four panelists that are here with me. Not only the implications for boosting trade between the European Union and Japan. Our trade figures are not high compared to our potential in GDP. As the Ambassador said, Japan and the European Union represent around 28% of global GDP, but only 0.5% of global trade, both in goods and services. So this agreement will have important implications for trade, but also important implications for the global economy and the global trends in trade. I have here with me Belén Romana to my right. She's a non-executive director at Santander Bank, and she's a former Director General for the Treasury and Director General for Economic Policy at the Ministry of Economy. Mr. Miguel Otero, also to my right. He's a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and a research associate at the European Union Asia Institute at ESCA School of Management in France. To my left, I have Yukari Akeda. She lectures international relations at Rikyo Law School in Tokyo, and also she was a member of the Japanese delegation that negotiated the EPA between Japan and the European Union. And finally, here to my left, Gabriel Felbermayr, who is the director at the IFO Center for International Economics, and is a specialist in the international economics. We are going from the global picture to the implications for the global economy of this agreement, to more concrete implications for the trade and the relationships between European Union and Japan, and also concrete forms of cooperation between European Union and Japan. And in particular, we will talk about how this new agreement can help boost the digital economy and all the technological aspects of the economy in the European Union. Let me start with Gabriel Felbermayr, and he will analyze how this agreement can revitalize the international liberal economic order. Please, Mr. Felbermayr.
Thank you, Mr. Kaiser, and thanks also to the organizers for having me in beautiful Madrid and in this fantastic setting. Thank you very much. I'd like to touch on 5 points, try to answer 5 questions. First of all, the question is, how significant is this EPA for the world? The second question is, how relevant is it in terms of innovating in the world trade order? The third question, how relevant can it be for the EU and the Japanese economies? Fourth question is, how relevant is it for outsiders? What does it mean for the rest of the world? And the fifth question turns a little bit inside into the European Union and asks, how does this EPA fit into the overall European trade policy strategy? Now, 5 questions, 7 minutes, so there's a bit of an ambitious plan here. So I'll be short on all these questions, and I think we'll be discussing them a little bit more later. Now, in trade policy, I think size matters, and more so now in these days that have been discussed already. And it's clear that the joint GDP of these two economies, the European and the Japanese, together amount to $22 trillion US. So this is big. It's 27.5% of world GDP as of 2017. It's approximately as big as NAFTA, now also known as USMCA. It's a little bit more, double actually more as the CPTPP, so this other big trade policy reform that has happened in Japan. It is smaller than the US-Japan agreement. So if that is being negotiated, if it would come to fruition, would be a little bit larger. And it's also smaller than RCEP. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, negotiated in East Asia, including Japan, China, and the ASEAN countries, India also. So that would be bigger in size. So it's big, but it's not the biggest game in town, if you like. Jose Luis has already mentioned that trade is actually relatively low between the EU and Japan. If we add everything up, exports and imports, goods and services, we talk about $209 billion US. That's not a small number, but compared to the size of the economies, it's relatively little nonetheless. But, of course, the EU and Japan are both important trading nations. They might not trade so much bilaterally, but they trade a lot with the world. And about 22% of world trade actually involves either the European Union or Japan. That's almost a quarter. So for the world trade system, the EU and the Japan together are very important. Now, that leads me to the question, how innovative is this agreement? Because if we ask, will the agreement change the world trade order? If we only look at bilateral trade, we would probably have to be sober and say, it's too small, right? 1% of world trade, market access, if it were only market access, we wouldn't really expect from this agreement to have a large systemic implication. But to the extent that the EPA has multilateral relevance, because it covers themes that are relevant not just bilaterally but multilaterally, then this agreement could be a game changer. And it could be a game changer also because it affects a lot of trade. We're talking about a quarter of world trade. And of course, there are elements in the agreement that are of this nature. We talk about, for example, the chapter on corporate governance, which is something new, has never been actually touched in a trade agreement. That is not something that is only bilateral in nature and affects only the small portion of trade that happens between the EU and Japan, but it matters multilateral for all the trade going out of Europe and all the trade going out of Japan. That could be something that remains and is a legacy of this agreement. Or the chapter on small and medium enterprises, or the provisions on intellectual property, or another relatively new element in a trade agreement, its provisions on climate change. So these are elements that go much beyond market access, and because they affect the entire working of the regulatory system, both in the EU and Japan, are important for the world trade system, even if bilateral trade between the EU and Japan is relatively small. Let me also put some water in the wine. Of course, we all are interested in the digital economy, and in this area, the EU-Japan agreement is not as ambitious as some would have hoped it would be. I think we have still a lot to celebrate, this agreement is good to have, but forward-looking, I think there is a missed opportunity, and we should talk about prolonged dialogue between the EU and Japan to make further progress in these areas. In particular, because the CPTPP, so this agreement of Japan with the 10 other Asia-Pacific and American-Pacific nations, does have ambitious provisions in the area of data flows and digital protectionism, so that we have issues here that need to be sorted out. Now, I'm an economist, and we have relatively early on tried to quantify the benefits of the EU-Japan trade agreement in a study together with colleagues from Keio University in Tokyo. And I'll give you some insights here, where the intellectually interesting point is that the EU and Japan have very different business models in serving foreign markets. Europe has served, or has traditionally served, the Japanese market through exports. But Japan has served the European market much more through a local presence here in Europe. So if you look at FDI statistics, they're very skewed. Japan FDI in Europe is big, European FDI in Japan is much smaller. And the big question now for the trade analyst is, how will that switch once the agreement is in place? Because producing cars in Europe has been more beneficial than importing cars into Europe because of high import tariffs. 10% is a number that protects the European market. Now, if those tariffs go to zero, slowly but steadily, will that mean that Japanese car makers start exporting to Europe more and stop producing locally? That has implications, of course, for value added in Europe and could be a downside. No? It could be something that reduces value added in the overall European car manufacturing area. Will that happen? To what extent will that happen? That's an interesting question that we have to answer in this analysis. And indeed, what we find is that one sector in Europe that's going to lose from this agreement could be the automotive sector, if indeed Japanese car makers, switch the servicing mode from FDI to exports. Other sectors would benefit quite handsomely, and the most important here is the agri-food complex. So that goes beyond simply agriculture, but the entire food industry. Now, in terms of benefits for those economies, we find that Japan could see its GDP go up by something like 9 billion euros every year. So GDP being a flow number, this comes back every year. Europe would benefit approximately in the same order of magnitude, but because the European economy is much larger, in terms of percentage gains, there is an asymmetry. 0.3% GDP gain in Japan, 0.1% GDP gain in Europe. Now, these numbers are relatively small, but they are based, of course, exclusively on market access, right? So the reduction of tariffs, reduction of costs of non-tariff barriers, they do not include what is probably much more important, namely those provisions that affect not just bilateral trade, but the general trade picture that I've talked before. So these are not in those numbers. We don't have any good way to quantify them. So these are lower bounds. In terms of value created, nonetheless, this is important. In total for the world, almost 20 billion euro additional value added. So this means wages, jobs, interest payments, taxes. This is relevant in terms of quantities. For Spain, we have the number in our report too. For Spain, this agreement, if you just narrow it down to its economic benefits, is relatively unimportant. You're talking about €500 million value added additional for the Japanese economy. This is not huge, but it's of course something that one doesn't want to reject. Now, if we are to ask how does this agreement affect the world trade system, we also have to ask how does it affect outsiders. And here the good news is that it is not harming anyone else, not really. There's this old obsession of economists. Jacob Weiner has started this after World War II. Do trade agreements between two countries harm the outsiders? And in this agreement, we don't see much of that. And the reason is that in particular the Japanese economy, but also the European ones, are well connected to other countries in global value chains. So if Japan exports more to Europe, then it demands more inputs, for example, from Vietnam or from Indonesia because these are required in exports to the European Union. And if Europe exports more to Japan, the same is true, for example, with regard to North Africa. Nonetheless, it is easy to see that one country would lose out of this agreement, and maybe that's also a side effect that's not absolutely unwelcome, and that would be China. So in our numbers, we find China would lose 1.2 billion euro. Now, again, this is compared to the entire GDP of China is really, really a very small number, but nonetheless, it's statistically significant and it is negative. Now, last point, Europe, of course, has a very ambitious trade policy agenda, and Japan has such an agenda too. We talked about RCEP already, or about the Japanese-US trade agreement that's being negotiated these days. Europe has a large agenda as well, and the question is the overall stance of European trade policy as liberal as we might want it to be? Right? So if we can celebrate the EU-Japan agreement, and I think we should, but then I would like to say just a few words about the stance of overall European trade policy position, where criticism is in place. I think it's a problem that we have now our own steel and aluminum safeguards, which are also effective against Japanese steel and aluminum exports. We have anti-dumping activities that are more important now in Europe than they have been before. They rarely affect Japan directly, but they affect Japan through its global value chain effects. That too is something that is not very cooperative, probably. We have the goods package regulation that is being prepared now in the European Union, which has the danger of discriminating against foreign exporters, Japan included. And we have the return of old school industrial policy in Europe. Maybe you have watched 2 days ago the joint declaration by Peter Altmaier, the German economics minister, and his counterpart in Paris, Bruno Le Maire. You know, the two want to revive a European industrial policy, and that has many merits. I don't want to criticize this globally, but it also has, of course, the danger that it brings back a flavor of protectionism, for example, by using competition policy to establish European champions to gain market share from other countries. So, at the end, I like the EU-Japan agreement. There's a lot, I think, that gives us reason to celebrate, but the overall trade policy stance, in particular in Europe, is not as rosy as it should be. There is a lot of work to be done, but the EPA certainly is a very good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And I guess you ask yourself and the audience many questions, and one of them is going to be answered by Ms. Akeda. And what do you think are the implications for trade of this agreement? You were involved in the negotiations, and you probably analyzed the impact for trade flows between the European Union and Japan. How can affect this agreement to help foster trade between the two blocs, as we have seen that the trade figures are low compared to the GDP potential?
Thank you very much. I could not agree more with Gabriel. This agreement is very, very ambitious and comprehensive. But I also pointed out this agreement has much more broader coverage than current text, because Gabriel mentioned about the digital economy. It's the EPA didn't attain ambitious provisions, but it has link to the outside negotiations. And this last January, EU and Japan agreed to mutually the adequate status of data flow. So this is not inside the text, but it's closely linked. And this is actually the nature of this EPA to forward-looking. It's a possibility expansion, the agenda, even the actual text, and continuing discussion between the EU and Japan, and shape the new rules in the future. That's the one of the most innovative aspect of this agreement. And it's a bit different from your question, but I'd like to point out, because this agreement now entered into force. So from now on, the most important agenda is how to maximize the benefit of this agreement. Because this agreement has such a potential, but it doesn't make sense if nobody aware this importance. And also the government is lazy to sincerely implement. But I'd like to point out that this agreement has also very innovative aspect about implementation and monitoring. For example, not only this EPA, but most of FTA has built-in institution for implementation monitoring. For example, the joint committee, specialized committees, and working groups and DSPs. But this is from European Union's initiative. DigiTrade decided to open all negotiations and the result of these committees result published through the website. It's already started by CETA, EU-Canada agreement, but the European Commission is very eager to push forward this transparency policy to the implementation process of EU-Japan EPA. So this is European Union's initiative, and Japan actually not ready for that level of transparency. But it also doesn't make sense for Japan to close even counterpart is open everything. So this process is open for public or stakeholders to strictly check, scrutinize the implementation process of EPA. So this is the one point. And the second point is also from the European Union initiative. The EU started a very comprehensive, ambitious implementation monitoring project for EU-Japan EPA. This is the very first, most comprehensive project. Before, EU also had this, monitoring project for the EU-Korea FTA and also CETA. But this time, it's more, a bigger project and had very, big budget. And this project will produce not only annual monitoring report, but many, many thematic sector-specific reports every year, and also organize, international conference, workshops, and research project, and also create a very comprehensive website to make this EPA very user-friendly for every stakeholder. So this is European Union's, again, initiative, but it also affects Japanese government's policy too. And in terms of Japan, Japan has already started to make this EPA, the awareness of people about this EPA certain, not only this year, but last year when the agreement finally signed, Japanese government started so-called 100 seminars about EPA. This is a one-year project, and the JETRO started seminars all over Japan, even in the small cities. And the purpose is to make, to explain the benefit of EPA to mainly small and medium enterprises. So they explain how to establish, rule of origin certification. It's still very complex and difficult to make this certification. But the Japanese government is sincerely try to promote this EPA, and it's already started. And also, Japanese government established a website for SMEs to make every link about EPA for the small companies. So all these aspects, it's not unilateral. It will affect each other. And it's also a learning process of implementation. So this innovative aspect also very important nature of this EPA, and I believe will produce a very positive actual effect, economic effect, and sustainable cooperation between two.
Thank you. May I turn now to Mr. Otero, and if you could explain a little bit more on different forms of cooperation between the European Union and Japan in different fields, and how the agreement can help improve these forms of cooperation.
Thank you, José Luis. Thank you to Mario for making this possible, for all the coordination, and the Japanese Embassy as well for the cooperation in this. It's a pleasure to discuss this agreement and some of the implications. I'm going to come on this from a political economy angle. We had the economics part of it. I think it's important to see the broader picture on the political economy of this, both at the global level, at the bilateral level between the European Union and Japan, and perhaps even at the micro level, at what it means for individuals, firms and individuals. And I have 7 points, 7 minutes, 7 points, one minute per point. The first one is that I think we should be cautious. I think the global elite should be cautious about pushing for more globalization without understanding the consequences of this. And I think the last years have shown us a lot of signals about how there are winners and losers of this process, and how the losers are getting louder and more extreme, more radical. And therefore, we need to bear this in mind when we want to cooperate further in deepening economic integration, which is essentially what this treaty is about. Usually, there is a big consensus among economists that free trade is good, that economic cooperation is good overall, that economic deepening, interdependence is good, not only for economic reasons, but for social and political reasons. It avoids conflicts, in principle, theoretically speaking. But I think there is an emerging consensus as well that although this is good for our societies as a whole, it has adjustment costs. And there are certain pockets of people, of firms, of players that will have to adjust. And if we enter into the field of not only reducing tariffs, but as well harmonizing standards, rules, norms, then, of course, adjustments will happen. Broadly speaking, we are seeing that, as was mentioned by Gabriel, that this is a treaty that is beneficial for the agro-business of Europe that will export more to Japan. And this is in principle beneficial for Japanese car makers that they can penetrate better, easier, the European market. And as Gabriel was saying, if you assume, for example, that the Japanese car producers, they will not produce so many cars in Europe, they will produce them in Japan and export them here, these are adjustment costs. There are people that will be affected by this. And we know as well that a lot of the anti-globalization, anti-free trade movement goes against China. So at the global level, Japan and the European Union, of course, need to work more on what do we do with the WTO? What do we do with an organization that is incapable to hold and govern, get inside its organization an economy like the Chinese that is a state capitalist economy. Right? This is a major point, and this is where we have to work. So we have to work at the global level in all the multilateral fora, reform of the WTO, what can be done at the G20, what can be done in all the multilateral fora. But I think we need to work as well together bilaterally on what kind of effects this can produce, because it is not only the impact of China in the world economy, but of course, so it's trade, but of course, and this will be tackled, I guess, by Berlin as well, technology, right? Technology will affect us, and so if it is not because, the competition will be stronger from Japan, whatever, because we have more competition, which is good, this competition might be because of trade or because of technology, right? So even German car manufacturers, or a lot of the car manufacturing industry here in Spain, they might use even more technology, even more robots to produce these goods. And so again, this has a displacement effect, right? And so what do we do with that? One issue that is big as well from the political economy standpoint is the issue of inequality. Now, we discuss a lot about inequality. I see here my chairman. There's a lot of debate about whether inequality is measured appropriately or not, whether it's good to a certain extent, how bad is it, how much does it damage growth or not. But what we are seeing in the last 20 years, and this is, I think, a consensus, that social mobility has been reduced. So the possibility for you to come from a poor family and be able to go up the ranks, both, even in Japan, which is one of the most unequal, but I have seen recent data about Japan, inequality levels have increased. And the social mobility, has been reduced too. And so if we believe in the liberal order, which is the open and fair and open international order, so the liberal order, if there is one pillar of the liberal order, it's the pillar of social mobility. That people have equal opportunities from the start. And this is undermined. And if we don't address this bilaterally, in this case, EU, Japan, we are in big trouble. Because the Chinese and the American societies can deal with inequality much better than us. We are societies in Europe and Japan that historically, socially speaking, we can handle inequality much worse, right? And so this is always a problem for us. And so what can be done? I think, and this was mentioned by Gabriel, more needs to be done bilaterally, and this is the next step, on the impact of the new technology, artificial intelligence, digitalization. What do we do with data? Usage of data, movement of data, storage of data, right? This is a field where there has been very little cooperation yet. And in a moment, and if one of the things that I read recently by Altmaier, where he's right, is that the collection of data today in the digitalized economy is the basic technology, and it's equal to the steam machine in the first industrial revolution. So if you don't produce these digital platforms, and apparently Japan and Belen, I think, will tell you more about this, Japan and Europe have very little digital platforms in comparison with the United States and China. And so this is a common struggle, common challenge for both. And how do we cooperate to create this? How do we have to, again, this is a big debate, have national champions, European, Japanese national champions, or are we happy to use, platforms from third countries, but we are keen on protecting the data, how the data are used, because at the end of the day, in 5G, which is the next big revolution, in 5G, the production and storage and usage and analysis of data is going to be key. If you don't have that, you are out of the race. So this is a big issue. So, there's the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation. A lot can be done on this, for example, on this front. And then on education, right? We have done a paper recently, some of us, on how technology creates disruption. How can we use technology to mitigate the effects of the disruption of technology? And for me, we should start by education. And here I call really to the micro. Right, I mean, Japan and Europe, certain countries in Europe, for example, the dual vocational training systems, are perhaps the best equipped education systems to deal with the next industrial technological revolution. So a lot of cooperation could happen there. Technology can be very useful in all levels. I'm not going to, if there are more questions, but you can identify those students that struggle. You can have open access. You can, so cooperation on industry between EU and Japan, but I would really like to see more cooperation on education between EU and Japan, best practices, how can we improve from each other, how can we really share best experiences. By the way, because there's, in this country, for example, now an urge, and me as a university lecturer, there's a big urge now to use technology everywhere in education. Well, Japan is a place that has good PISA records, generally, where technology is used the least in classrooms. It is used, but in a smart manner. So because, at the end of the day, it's not about how much technology you use, it's how smart you use it, right? But it can be very useful technology to advance and to create this social mobility that is needed for people, right, that struggle. I mean, and the latest data on this are, for example, in this country, but not only in this country, overall, your level of career potential is determined by the years of education of your mother. Right? Very strong correlation. The less years your mother has studied, the less probabilities you have to have a higher income in your lifespan as a worker. Right? And so again, this is a big bias that we have, and that technology in a way can help us to overcome those biases, because in the classroom, technology can be used to overcome these effects. Now, another thing that I think I'm finishing is if you want better education, you need money. And those countries that are more open tend to be those countries that have more robust welfare systems. Think of the Netherlands. How do you fund that? Well, I think more has to be done on that these digital platforms need to pay their fair share, right? Big companies, there's a big debate about that. We are talking about the Google tax, which is, I think, a bad way to talk about this. But we have to really, make sure that big tech companies, but not only tech companies, all sorts of companies, they pay. And I know that Anna Botín has talked a lot about this recently, that, they have to pay their fair share, and they should pay the taxes in the country where they make the profits. And that's a big debate, where, again, I saw recently as well that there were big scandals about tax evasion of Google in Japan. And so I guess here, more collaboration between EU and Japan could be possible, bilaterally, but as well multilaterally. And perhaps some sort of, the EU has the EU Globalization Adjustment Fund. Perhaps we need some sort of not only a Globalization Adjustment Fund, but the EU Tech Adjustment Fund, possibly. Final point, which is the seventh, is not only do we need this, but I think we need, between EU and Japan, more networking. Okay? I mean, the trade figures that we have are, in a way, a reflection of insularity. Okay? There is not enough interdependence, interpersonal relations between Europe and Japan yet. And so I would encourage, for example, the Spain-Japan Council, all sorts of councils that we had at the civil society, of having, this is what the United States does a lot, exchange programs, where young leaders, for example, from Europe and Japan, young leaders spend 1 week together. This creates networks, this creates connections, personal connections. Only if we create more interpersonal interdependence can we actually deepen our economic integration. And I leave it there.
Thank you, Miguel. As you pointed out, now all the digital economy elements and digital trade are becoming more and more important. And I would like to ask Belén Romana, how can this EPA help to increase the technological level and the digital connection between the European Union and Japan? When we read the news, we see that the European Union is lagging behind this digital race, and how can this agreement with Japan help to upgrade our technological level and our digital level?
Thank you very much. I think that, thank you for having me here in the first place. In the second place, I mean, I think this could be a very long day because of the list of things that we could be debating, and I find extremely interesting. Education is one of the things that I would love to debate around, and whether it's only about money. But that's a different topic that probably another day we could discuss. I was thinking of Udacity or the Khan Academy or things like that. That could be elements of the debate. But back to the key point. I think that has been mentioned as well, the shortcomings, but as well the new avenues that this agreement has created. And I think that we should follow those avenues, because trade is key, we all know that. But we live in a world where digital, which is not exactly trade, is shaping our world. And in my view, there are like a few things I would like to mention. One is, I do agree that Europe is lagging behind. We should be doing something. And I think that Japan can help us in many ways. We could learn, we could, and we could have a very useful debate about the rules of the game. And my point being that we are living in a world where there's a level which is digital, which is extremely active, extremely valuable, but where the rules of the game are still to be determined. And no one really knows what kind of rules of the games we should have. But I will mention a few things. One is the network effects are giving birth to these huge giants which are becoming monopolies. Then we have an emerging worldwide duopoly, which is China and the US, because those giants come from China or the US, and basically no one else has that. So we do have monopolies and duopolies in different ways. We all know, we have had for many centuries rules that prevent us from suffering piracy in the seas. But we have pirates at home, in our bedroom, in our kitchen. And there's nothing that creates a framework that A, understands what a pirate is, B, protect us and give us tools to understand what we may be suffering. And then you mentioned that, data as oil, that's someone said. It's quite weird, because if data is oil, all of a sudden we give it away. So there are no rules that make us understand how exchanges take place, how can we put a price, what it is that a market, a well-functioning market, show you whose supply, whose demand, how prices are set, property rights. Data lacks all of that. The data markets lack all of that framework. And that leads us to a situation where it's quite difficult for us it's not only about data protection, that's great, but it's also the value of data. Someone is getting the value of the data, so we should create frameworks to understand how that works. And then AI. So I think we will in a world that increasingly AI will be the prevalent technology everywhere. And we face huge, again, debates around AI because of the bias, the potential bias of AI, sometimes the lack of transparency, the difficulty of having explainable algorithms. So there's a huge range of things that we have to debate around. And then the future of jobs. So we all are familiar with now a long list of studies saying that automation will lead us to a huge loss of jobs. Depending on the study, you may be frightened or you might be just terrorized. So the rules of the game are still to be drawn. And I think that Japan and the European Union can work together, and we can learn from tech robotics. One of the things that I find interesting is if you take robot per 100 workers, you see that South Korea has 4.8, Japan has 3.1, Germany 2.9, and Spain we are 1.3, which means that it looks like countries with a high usage of robots do not lead to a high unemployment rate, so maybe we should have a thought around that. How can, I mean, whether it is automatic, never better said, that a higher number of robots leads to a higher unemployment rate, or there's another way. And I think that Japan has a different way of understanding how can it make it compatible to have high employment rates with high robotics. And I think that Europe could learn from that as well. And then another sort of a specific point that I wanted to make is, in this volatile world, where technology is changing everything, I think, we see companies dying at a really, really fast pace. And I think that Japan as well has some examples that we could learn from. And I will give you one example that for me was quite striking looking at it, which is the comparison between Fujifilm and Kodak. And I think that's really, really pretty interesting. In fact, I'm writing an article because I find it so interesting. So from 2003 to 2010, so in 7 years, both Fujifilm and Kodak saw their key market, which was films, disappear. Just, it was wiped out by digital cameras. The reaction was completely different. So you take Fujifilm, what they did was, okay, we do have a know-how and a technology, what can we do with it? So they did a few things. Maybe around additional sources of revenues. So they went into healthcare, they went into skincare, and they had a research, and now they own 70% of the world. There's a specific material protecting screens. Fujifilm owns 70% of that material in the world. So the outcome was that from 2000 to 2010, Kodak lost 50% of the revenues. Fujifilm increased 57% the revenues. So there you have two companies facing exactly the same sort of technological distress with completely different reactions. So again, I think that Japan could help us as Europeans understand some of the challenges that we face. How can we face them? And for me, the most important part of it is in this duopoly world where China and the US are the big giants again, I think we need to work together to create this framework, these rules of the game, where again, people do not feel isolated or not understood, or they feel like this is the key of inequality. And it's open to debate whether that's the case or not, but I think that it's quite clear that we need to understand how this new world should work. Not the way it works, which I think we are starting to understand, but how should it work? This international order in many ways, but absolutely in economic terms, how does it work in a way that helps us all? And I will close it with platforms. And again, the big platforms are either Chinese or American. But I would go further from that, which is ecosystems, which again are basically being born in those two big countries. We will all live in ecosystems at some point. So in digital ecosystems, I meant. So again, if we don't understand how the rules of the game will work, we will be living in other ecosystems that are not designed for us, which is never very comfortable. So I do think that this is a framework, this the Japan and European agreement, but not only in terms of trade, which is key fully agree with that, but also trying to really determine these future rules of the game that we both are comfortable with.
Thank you, Belén.